I am Diana Konaté. I am the Policy Director at African Communities Together. African Communities Together is a membership-based organization of African immigrants fighting for civil rights, opportunity, and a better life for our families here in the US. We provide direct legal services to African immigrants where we are located. We're located in New York, in the DC area, so DC, Virginia, Maryland, and we recently opened a Philly chapter. So we're also located in Philly now. So we provide direct legal services, we organize our communities, and we engage in advocacy at the local, state, and federal level. So I am responsible for our federal advocacy. I will turn it over to Hiwot, who will introduce herself and the work that she does here at ACT.
Sure. Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for taking your time and joining us this evening to talk about TPS. My name is Hiwot Berihun. I am the DMV Legal Director for ACT. I've been with ACT about 5 years. We provide immigration legal services to the community. We mainly serve DC residents. We provide N-400s, naturalization, family petitions at our DC office. I look forward to chatting with everybody regarding TPS and how you can apply for it, the types of form and eligibility for the benefit.
Thanks, Hiwot. And before we actually get started in the started with the presentation, I just wanted to make a few quick notes. One is that this presentation is being recorded. That's so that if anybody isn't able to join tonight, they'll be able to view it at a later time. And it will be available at our YouTube page in a few days. Two, if you all could please visit our website, which is africans.us, and follow us on social media to stay up to date with the work that we do and how we're engaging the African community here in the US, African immigrant community. We are at Africans US on all social media platforms. And then lastly, we are going to take questions at the end of the presentations. So if you could try to save your questions for that, for the end of the presentation, that would be very much appreciated. And also because we are recording the presentation and this presentation will be publicly available on the internet, please do not include any personal information in any of the questions that you ask, because this webinar will be available publicly. So with that, we will get started. And I will start off the presentation. On your screen right now is the general flow of our presentation. I will start off with the policy aspect of TPS, what it is, and advocacy around TPS. And then Hiwot will cover the legal aspect. So actually applying for the benefit, and we'll end with a few minutes of Q&A. Next page. Or next slide. Thank you. So first, starting off with what is TPS? TPS is a form of humanitarian protection. Oh. All right, TPS is a form of humanitarian protection, and it provides temporary protection from deportation and provides the ability to work here in the US, and that protection comes when a person's country conditions make it unsafe for them to be returned to that country. The Department of Homeland Security, DHS, is the agency that makes the determination on what countries can have TPS. And with TPS, unlike asylum, which is based on an individual's specific circumstances and their fear of persecution back in their home country, TPS is country-based. So it's blanket protection for an entire country. And there's no need to show a fear of persecution. You essentially just apply. And like I mentioned, TPS allows a person to work legally in the US. It allows a person to travel outside of the US at DHS's discretion. But if the person wants to work and wants to travel, those are also applications that an individual has to apply for. So the statutory requirements for TPS, DHS can only provide this temporary protection if a country is experiencing three things, or one of three things, I should say. One, armed conflict. Two, some sort of environmental disaster. Or three, an extraordinary but temporary condition. So an example of an extraordinary but temporary condition was when several countries, or when there was an outbreak of Ebola in West Africa, and several countries, Liberia, Guinea, and Sierra Leone, got TPS protection because of Ebola happening in that country and killing a lot of people in those countries. TPS protects people who are currently in the US. You must be living in the US from a certain date, be continually present in the US from a certain date, and that date varies by country. And also people must apply for it. So if you don't apply for TPS, you don't get TPS, essentially. Another thing that I wanted to talk about is the difference between TPS, temporary protected status, and DED, deferred enforced departure. And I just wanted to say a few words about this because they're very similar, but at the same time, they're different. So DED, deferred enforced departure, is similar to TPS in that it provides protections. It provides the same protection, so protection from deportation and the ability to work, but it's a little different because unlike TPS, it's not DHS that gives it, it's the president that gives it. Also, unlike TPS, where you have to apply for it, with DED, it's just a blanket deportation protection for anybody from a country that's designated for DED. The only thing you have to apply for if you want is a work authorization, if you're if that's what you want. But the DED protection, the protection from deportation is automatic. There's nothing you need to do to apply for it. And then the third thing that's different about DED is that the president doesn't have to grant DED in those three specific instances that I mentioned. So the president isn't limited to when he can grant DED. So for example, a country that has had DED for a long time is Liberia. They started out with TPS in the 90s, in 1991. And when Liberia no longer warranted TPS, the president at the time, President Bush, granted Liberians DED. And Liberians have had DED for quite some time. And most recently, it was extended this year into 2024. So that's another form of protection that that ACT and a lot of other organizations fight for, to protect our people and allow them to work legally while they're in this country. Moving on to talk a little bit about the countries that currently have TPS and the work that ACT does with TPS. So there are currently 15 countries that are designated for TPS. Unfortunately, 4 of them are only protected through the courts. And those 4 countries could potentially see their protection end this December, so next month. So we are involved in a lot of advocacy to push the Biden administration to redesignate TPS for those 4 countries. But ACT works specifically on 5 African countries that have been designated for TPS. That includes Somalia, Sudan, South Sudan, Cameroon, and Ethiopia. Ethiopia is the newest designation that came a few weeks ago. Somalia's designation expires in March of 2023. So we are about to start a campaign to push the government to extend TPS for Somalia, so to make sure that Somalis continue to be protected through TPS, and also open it up so that new Somali get to be protected by TPS. So Somalia's TPS expires in March. Then Sudan's TPS expires in October of next year. We will do the same thing to try to work to make sure that Sudanese individuals remain protected. After that comes in November, South Sudan's TPS will expire. We'll do more advocacy there. Cameroon's expires in December 2023. And then Ethiopia's TPS will expire 18 months after the Federal Register notice is published. So even though the DHS has designated Ethiopia for TPS, the Federal Register notice is the actual mechanism, the document that will actually allow people to start applying for TPS. So right now, Ethiopians can't apply for TPS until that Federal Register notice is published. Once that Federal Register notice is published, it has been taking about a month for the government to publish that. But once that Federal Register is published, it will outline how Ethiopians can apply for TPS. And it will also tell us the dates that Ethiopians are covered. So it'll the protection will be for 18 months, starting at the date that the Federal Register is published. So those are the current TPS designations, specifically Africans. There are many more outside of the African continent, but ACT has been focused on the African TPS designations. There are also, in addition to our advocacy to extend TPS designation for the current countries, we also do a lot of advocacy to get new TPS designations. So some of the countries that we've been asking the Biden administration to designate for TPS, these countries don't have TPS yet, but we think that they warrant TPS because of the conditions in those countries. We've been asking the government to give TPS to Mauritania. Mauritania in particular has had the Black Mauritanians in that country have suffered from severe discrimination, including slavery. And for that reason, we believe that the country warrants TPS. In the case of Mali and the Democratic Republic of Congo, those are two other countries that we're calling on the government to designate TPS. Those two countries have been experiencing armed conflict for many years now. And that armed conflict makes it very unsafe for people to be returned to those countries. So our advocacy for new TPS designations focus on those countries: Mali, Mauritania, and the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo. So last few minutes, I just want to talk about general advocacy for TPS and what it takes. The bottom line is that winning TPS takes a lot of community involvement. It takes a lot of community engagement. In our past experiences, it's not something that the administration is just going to give to our communities. We have seen the administration quickly give TPS to other communities. For example, Ukraine, about 2 to 3 weeks after the war in Ukraine started, the administration gave that country a TPS designation. On the other hand, we've seen that the conflict in Ethiopia had been going on for quite some time before that country got a designation. And Cameroon also had a conflict going on for many years before they saw a designation. And that required communities to rally often, really fight really hard. It required people telling their stories to the media. It required people coming out to lobby visits to talk to their members of Congress about why TPS is important, what life is like, without TPS, without any kind of protection, the stress that it causes, the inability that some people have to work because they don't have work authorization, and just the general stress of fearing being returned to a country that's not safe. So, we do a lot of organizing in the various communities, but this is all led by the folks who are, or it has to be led by the folks who are directly impacted and who would directly benefit from TPS. Most of our advocacy has been legislatively, so in Congress and with the administration administratively, but there are some instances where we have to fight in court. And that happened with the Sudanese TPS designation when former President Trump came into office. He started terminating all TPS. One of the designations that he ended was Sudan, TPS for Sudan, even as the country was still experiencing unsafe conditions. So as a result of that, we sued the Trump administration, arguing that they improperly terminated TPS for Sudan and other countries. That required us, again, going into the community, finding people who were impacted, and having them join the lawsuit, so that Sudanese individuals were involved in the lawsuit against the government. And that lawsuit is what protected Sudanese TPS holders for quite a few years. and that lawsuit is still ongoing. So, you know, protection is possible, but it does take a lot of work. And sometimes it even takes suing. I just, you know, my presentation was just to cover the basics about TPS. I encourage those of you who are here to, you know, stay engaged in our advocacy work around TPS, because even though TPS, a lot of countries have TPS now, it's not guaranteed. So every 18 months, we do have to go back to the administration. We do have to go back to Congress to make our voices heard and ensure that they continue to protect our communities, and not just protect the communities that have TPS, but expand that protection to communities that don't have TPS. And with that, I will pass it to Hiwot, who will start on the second part of the presentation.
Thank you, Diana. That was super informative. I'll go over the practicality of applying for TPS. And then, like she said, we'll take questions right afterwards. So you find out that your country has been designated for TPS. What do you need to do to apply for it? So TPS, like Diana said, is country specific. So the most recent one is Ethiopian. So we've been getting a lot of calls in our office, you know, what do we need to do to apply for it? Because the registry is not out, you won't be able to apply for it until the registration is out. But once it is out, or if you want to look and see whether or not you'll be eligible. So the first thing is you have to be a national of the designated country. So as of, so there are instances where people are Ethiopians and then have lived in a different country and have a different nationality or have become a citizen of that country. That wouldn't work. You would have to show that you are a national and you resided in the country previously. And then you have been in the US since the designation date. Let's just use Ethiopia as an example. The most recent one was October 22nd, 2022. So if you were lucky enough and if you were in the US at that time, you would be eligible. The third requirement is that you are admissible or you qualify for a waiver. A lot of folks that have been in this country have lengthy immigration history. So they have deportation orders, unlawful presence, or they've entered the country without admission. Those people, they would be able to qualify for a waiver, but again, it's case by case basis. And then obviously the last one is that you are not subject to, you don't have such an instance in your immigration history where you would not be eligible for it. So if you were caught, for drug trafficking, or if you have multiple conviction, or if you have a terrorist or genocide or controlled substance in your immigration history, there's nothing that you can waive for that when you apply for TPS. So in those instances, you will not be eligible for TPS. So we'll talk about the actual application for TPS. So it's a form called I-821. It's on the USCIS website. You can go to it and you'll be able to see the form on the website. And so each individual person has to apply for TPS. And if you're, and I have it as a thing here, where if you're a family member and if, for instance, you are a parent and you think like your child will be eligible for TPS based on that relationship, that the TPS benefit does not apply to that. So the child as an individual will have to be eligible and to apply for it. The filing fee is $50, and then there's also a biometrics fee of $85. And then obviously, depending on your age, it'll go up or lower. There are people who are under 14, they may not be, or over 80 something, that you may not be eligible to pay for the biometrics fee. With TPS, so with TPS, you get this actual status. And then if you want to work, you can apply for work authorization, which is the I-765. That fee is $410, and that's the document that would allow you to work in the US. If I can have folks mute, if you entered in, thank you for joining us. We have interpretation rooms, one in Amharic and one in Tigrinya. So please join if you need to. Again, we're recording the session, so we kindly ask that you don't ask specific questions related to your case. Somebody has raised their hand. Okay. All right, and then the third form that we'll talk about is the 601 waiver. So this is a waiver that I mentioned earlier, that you would use this waiver if you have something that may not qualify you to be able to apply for this status. So this would be something for unlawful presence or deportation order, or if you have used false documents in the past before. TPS is a very, very generous benefit. USCIS and DHS does not like that. They do not want you to be deported. They want you to stay here because they deem that the country is not safe for you to go back. So it's likely then not for you to have the waiver accepted for this benefit. And then the last one is a request for a fee waiver. We don't recommend that you apply using this on your own because it asks for a lot of evidence that's attached to it. So for a fee waiver, this basically allows you, you would attach this application along with the 821 and the 765, so you don't have to pay for the forms, which I mentioned is like 410 plus 135. But you would have to be able to meet the requirement for a fee waiver. So for instance, if you are making a certain amount based on your family's household, then you'll be able to make it. Or if you have some sort of benefit that you're receiving from the government, it could be public benefits like medical. Thank you. Good evening. Thank you everybody for joining. My name is Hiwot. I'm presenting on TPS. We're on the halfway through the presentation. If you like interpretation, please use the globe and move into either Tigrinya or Amharic interpretation that's available today. Okay. So a lot of the times when folks apply for TPS, because of their lengthy immigration history or the requirements, they need to provide a lot of evidence for folks, for USCIS. And folks tend to have a hard time gathering this evidence. It's important at your initial application that you put this evidence together so you're not getting what we call requests for evidence, which further delays your application. So initially, when you are submitting evidence for an 821, USCIS categorizes some evidence as primary and then some evidence as secondary to prove your nationality of origin. So primary evidence would be, for instance, a document that has your picture or your fingerprint. I see folks are raising your hands. If you can hold off until the end of the presentation, I'm glad to take your question unless it's about interpretation. So let's, going back to the evidentiary requirements. So one is the primary evidence, which includes your national identity that has either a photo or your fingerprint on it. So this includes a passport, a birth certificate, or anything that's issued by the federal or state level agency of your country. So it would be a driver's license, state ID, or public educational document that would have your picture or your fingerprint. And then the secondary evidence that they would ask, so primary evidence is like gold. So you won't be asked for an RFE if you provide these type of documents pertaining to your case. Secondary evidence are, we know like when folks leave their countries, they have a really hard time gathering up documents, especially if you're here. And if you haven't had that much connection, then you'll have a hard time. So there are times where we collect the secondary evidence. So for instance, baptism certificate, or documents that are like affidavits from your family member or folks that can attest to your nationality, of being a country that's designated by TPS. And then you have to show the entry requirement, right? So that you are in the US, if you've been admitted. So it could be an entry passport or an entry document on your passport or an I-94. If you don't have an entry document and you came in without inspection, then that may or may not require a waiver. But it's likely that because TPS is a generous benefit, that you would be allowed to apply for it, and you're more than likely not to get a status. And then to show, and I think this is the most important one, is physical and continuous presence. You can show evidence like rent documents, school. So the physical requirement is you must have been here on the date of the designation. So it's October 22nd. You can enter the country on October 23rd and be eligible for this TPS if you're from Ethiopia, or similarly from Sudan in April. I believe it was 14 or 19 of 2022 from those dates. And then from then on, you must have had continuous presence in the US. So it could be school records, hospital records, money order, and then folks that have been here a long time. We have clients that have been in this country for a long time, but they're undocumented. So you can get birth certificate of US born children or car records with that. So I'll go back to the waiver, the 601 waiver and the evidence that's required. We don't recommend that you do this on your own again. So the only way that you would be able to get a waiver for that is you have to show that you have family unity in the US, or it's a public interest or a humanitarian purpose. And then to show this, again, you would have to show some sort of birth certificate or ties to the US, and then affidavits, tax documents, and photographs that you've been living here for years, and that you want to stay here, and you should, when you apply for this status, then you'll be able to get a work permit, and then you'll be able to legally work in this country. I think I mentioned this again, and I'll say it, there's no derivative status, which means like a family member or a father or a spouse or a kid for his parents won't be able to apply TPS, and then a family member will not be able to share that status, which is what we call derivative, or apply for them, so they can also get the TPS status. There are different ways of filing this form. You can either do it online or mail. The only forms of online that is available for TPS is the I-821 and the work permit. So the actual TPS application as well as the work permit. The 601 and the travel documents are not available online. We highly recommend that you file on paper, not online. I think our recommendation is based on that it's assured that when you file on paper, that you sent it, you have somebody that's signing it, an officer when they receive it, because you would send it as mail receipt and then make sure USCIS has the signature required. Whereas if you were to file it online, you actually don't know or have documentation, unless maybe you can take a screenshots of the document when you submit it, but we don't know, like if the system crashes, we don't know what you filed. And it's just really hard to prove that you filed it in a time. And this is a time document, so it's important that you have documentation of what you filed and when you filed it. So you put the application together and now you're good. So you have You have TPS status, and then you have a work permit. Yay, that's great, right? So what does this benefit like you? One, it's for folks who don't have a work permit or who don't have asylum status, you get to work. And the second one is you're protected from deportation. And then the third is you can apply for a travel document, the I-130, which is that allows you to leave the country and come back. And then also, when you leave the country and come back, again, if you're an asylum document, I don't think I mentioned this earlier, if you're an asylee, we don't recommend that you go back to the country that you're seeking asylum from, even if you have TPS application, because your asylum application, it's still valid. And it's still, you're still subject to your credibility because of that application. So you can travel abroad to a country of where you did not ask for asylum from. And then I just want to lastly talk about what we've been getting questions regarding, you know, if I have an asylum, should I apply for TPS or should I apply for TPS and not asylum? So one of the biggest difference in terms of, you know, practicality and status is if you have asylum and if you have an asylum application that's successful, it'll lead to a green card, right? But if it doesn't lead to a green card and your asylum application is denied, you are put in removal proceeding, and you would be asked to leave the country, right? And then TPS does not have a path to a green card. TPS is a temporary status, but it will protect you from deportation, like I said. So even if you have asylum and even if you have a work permit, we highly advise that you apply for TPS. If the asylum doesn't work out, you can use your TPS to stay in this country and have a work permit using the TPS status to live in the US protected. And, you know, unfortunately with TPS, and I mean, actually, fortunately, because Ethiopia and other countries like Cameroon did not have it. It's a temporary status. So it was for Ethiopia, it'll be 18 months from the designation. So during that time, you'll have some protection. So you won't be forced to leave into the country if your asylum doesn't work out. But I think we, again, would just say, like, even if you have an asylum case and if you haven't been called, or even if you're, you know, if you think your interview is next week, we don't know what's going to happen. But if you have an asylum case and if you've been approved, the TPS is not beneficial. If you have a green card, do not apply for TPS. You don't need it. And then I think there was a question of whether or not, like, you can have like multiple work permit. You don't need it. You're going to have just one work permit. So you can pick asylum or TPS. And then if asylum doesn't work out, you can just use the TPS work permit when you're removal proceeding.